There was an incident that happened early in the conflict where a specific hacker group went after what they thought was a train system to help one side over the other, attacked it, and made the mistake of thinking it was a train system when it was really the anti-proliferation systems of Russia for nuclear attacks. And that put Russia's nuclear defenses on high alert because they thought that that was actually a nation state coming after them. That actually is what keeps me up at night, more so than two controlled nations kind of going at it.
Hi, I'm Ed D'Agostino. Welcome to Global Macro Update. Today we take a look at the murky world of computer malware, cyber espionage, and the very real risks to our nation's critical infrastructure, our personal data, and how AI is taking these cyber threats to new levels. My guest today is Kareem Hijazi, counterintelligence expert and founder of Vigilocity, a firm that monitors material breaches of our nation's public and private networks. You used a term, an acronym, APT, Advanced Persistent Threats. Can we start from there? I know that's a basic level, but maybe could you start off, just explain what that is and sort of where we're at with it today?
It's a great starting point, and you're totally right. It's so sprawling, as per our last conversation that we'll obviously dive into today. APTs, otherwise known as Advanced Persistent Threats, as you articulated, is a term that was designed to explain originally nation-state oriented or motivated groups, right? That had exactly what the term sounds like. They're persistent, they're advanced, they have very unlimited sort of time and resources to do things that normally cyber criminals would not effectively do. That was the original impetus behind the term. Unfortunately, today, it's sort of bled into cyber criminals using technology that would be considered an APT. And it's the other problem with this is that people get wrapped around the axle on, is the APT the actor or is it the tools that they're using? And it's sort of all of it, because the threat as a collective is the actor's motivations and what we call the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures or protocols, as well as the tooling they're using and the implants. So it's the whole thing. And what they do with that is a campaign. And usually we hear the word campaign in a fairly positive connotation. This one, unfortunately, is negative. The campaigns are widespread, sprawling, and again, very variable when it comes to the agenda, whether it's some sort of disinformation issue or if it's an information harvesting effort, whatever. But fundamentally, that term has now become the catch-all for cyber activity that's sophisticated in nature and very challenging to remediate. That's sort of now the foundational understanding of what APTs are.
You talked a little bit about harvesting of data, and it seems like that's the area that you tend to focus on a good amount, the sort of what we call phishing, right? It is far more pervasive than I realized. I get phishing emails once in a while at work, and I'm pretty good at figuring out what they are. At least I think I am.
I think we all think we are.
Yeah, but then you kind of blew my mind yesterday when we had a conversation, and you showed me you just picked a random company and typed it into your Vigilocity system, and you could see phishing activity going in and out of the company that they didn't even know about. Can you just quantify that for me and talk a little bit about who does it, what they're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So phishing is interesting. It sounds fairly innocuous. It's sort of a silly word too. You hear about spear phishing, right? Spear phishing is just another augmented term, which means that they're going to go after Ed or they're going to go after Kareem versus this sort of shotgun approach of catch anything you can catch with a lure, right? Which is where the term phishing sort of comes from. What's really interesting about what we covered before is that phishing is the first stage in usually some sort of attack. It's what they call, or what the threat actors sort of establish, which is initial access. So they'll send you or I or anyone an email, no matter how sophisticated we might be at trying to recognize things. It's gotten really, really good because they're using things like ChatGPT and other types of large language models that can put together narratives in these emails that look very human and even more specifically look like someone maybe because they can train it with things that they've collected or harvested from people that So you sort of look at this and go, oh, well, this is my friend Ed. Of course, I'm going to open this email. Strange email address, but you know what? It's exactly what he calls me. It's my nickname that he calls me. And he signed off the same way that he signs off normally. It's got to be Ed. I'm gonna click this because he's showing me a PDF file. Or HR company or HR teams within companies are the number one target because they have to open resumes and PDFs. So they're sort of stuck having to do what essentially gets the computers infected by design. So that's almost the perfect method to get inside. And once they're in, that's when the next stage sort of happens where they deploy what we call an implant, more commonly known as malware, or the old words, which are viruses. Malware is a little more sophisticated than a virus. A virus used to just sort of corrupt things. Malware actually is a spy. It's an electronic spy. And what we were looking at yesterday was an electronic spy that was deployed by a threat actor once they got that initial access, most likely from something like a phishing effort. And that spy sits and persists, back to APT. And it lives there and it stays there and it lurks and it laterally moves and it goes from Ed's computer to someone else's computer that you're connected to. And then it moves from that computer to 10 more. And it just proliferates itself in such a way that it becomes the ideal little silent, never sleeping, never water break, never food break spy that sends data back. And what we were looking at yesterday was basically the information it was sharing outbound from an organization that you would believe would have all the security in the world to protect themselves from that. And unfortunately, they don't.
And I won't rat out the name of the
No.
company on this program, but I will go so far as to say it was a very sophisticated tech-oriented company. So kind of shocking.
Right, absolutely. And it's one of many thousands that are in the system, unfortunately.
Let's take a quick break from today's interview so I can tell you about Malden Economics' new flagship investment letter called Macro Advantage. This is where my research team and I build a portfolio of ideas that are directly tied to the big themes and trends that you hear me and my guests talk about every week here. We identify the world's top investment themes, and then we build a portfolio around these themes, all while explaining how they tie together and why we make every recommendation. While the research is thorough, we explain our ideas in plain English so you can sleep at night knowing why you're invested. You can learn more about Macro Advantage by going to www.macro-advantage.com. That's macro-advantage.com. Thanks for your patience. Let's get back to the interview. And you described the malware as a spy, which is something else we touched on, that this is in many ways the evolution of espionage. This is a form
Correct.
of espionage today. Can you talk a little bit about, like, has it replaced sort of old school cloak and dagger espionage, or do they go hand in hand? What does espionage look like today?
I think it's both. In certain cases, it's cost effective and scalable to go electronic with it. And it's really effectively, everything is electronic. So wherever you want to get to, you can generally get there with some sort of technology. But the really sophisticated groups will go hand in hand. They'll use call centers to con people into answering a phone, and then, oh, can you check your email? I'm about to send you an email. Can you do that? So they sort of force the agenda. They make it feel like it's real. So there's a bit of a coercion and convincing utility around it. But to your point, it is the next evolution of spycraft and tradecraft. And I think the term I used with you was, we're in a new Cold War. We really are. It's just people can't feel it or see it. And it's even more cold than it was before because it's under the surface in a fairly murky and nebulous and cryptic world that most people just don't understand, right? It was very easy in the old days, which is, nuclear proliferation, who's winning, spies everywhere, James Bond, all that. But this is really complicated for a lot of folks, even though, as we talked about, it's not that complicated. It's just faster. It's the same things, just faster.
What is AI's role in all of this? Has it impacted effectiveness of bad actors at all?
It has. I hate to say it. AI has probably been most embraced in terms of its creativity and its use by nefarious actors or threat actors because, as usual, unfortunately, because it affords them the ability to force multiply themselves. That's the number one reason. What they would otherwise need a bunch of people to do, they can do. One person can do a whole lot of work with an AI tool that generates an incredible amount of not only the narratives for like a phishing email that we talked about, but also the malware itself. It'll actually write the code for the malware that is
Wow.
generally pretty well written, and there's a few tweaks here and there, but the what would take weeks or months is done in days.
Can you talk a little bit, Kareem, about what's at stake here? I mean, we talk about, like me sitting here in my remote solo office. I get a phishing email. I'm not hooked up to a big company network. Maybe I lose a little
Yeah.
bit of data. Like I think that's how people think of it. When really what we're talking
Yeah.
about is the country's critical infrastructure is at risk.
Right.
What does that
Indeed.
look like, and
Yes.
how is it at risk?
The everyday person doesn't feel like it can affect them. A lot of where individuals are worried about when it comes to hackers and threats is their identities, maybe their credit card information, their social security number, back to identity. But what's interesting is that in the world we're in now, the interconnectivity between even your computer and mine, by definition, there is one, right? You're looking into your screen, and I'm looking into my screen. My camera's picking up my image and sending it to you. There's effectively a link between us. So if you want to think of it from that perspective, right now we're connected. And so if there is, in theory, something on my machine, God forbid, and it wanted to sort of figure out who's Ed, and it goes into my email and it lurks around and it goes, "Ooh, Ed's got a lot of connections on LinkedIn, or he's got a really great follower base on YouTube. He's a good target for me to proliferate myself even further to his audience." So you think about it,
Wow.
that's the first step in terms of its reconnaissance risk, right? When you start thinking about yourself as a non-player when it comes to why you'd be interesting to a threat actor, you'd be surprised. The second thing that's really interesting is this is just a micro version of the macro problem, which is supply chain. Supply chain and third-party ecosystems are the number one challenge that we're having today, because small company leads to bigger company leads to government or critical infrastructure. So the pathway, the daisy chain, if you will, is small company, bigger company, critical infrastructure. And from small company, it could be a work from home individual that never left home after COVID because that was the policy of the company. But because there's no security protocols at home, they're the easiest targets in the world to get into. The VPN is simply a hypodermic needle into the corporation. The corporation's now access to many other organizations and so on. So that's just the super small taxonomy or sort of treeing out of essentially the connections out all the way from the individual to government or critical infrastructure, unfortunately.
I think you'd mentioned that some really big cutting edge technology has been bled out of corporations through this sort of process. Quantum was one that we talked about yesterday. That I thought that we were, like I was sitting here looking at IBM, thinking, if IBM gets quantum right, like this stock is going to go to the moon. Maybe
Right.
we should be looking at it. They seem to be the leaders. And then I spoke with you, and you're like, well, China's already got all that.
Unfortunately, China, as a nation state actor, has focused heavily on intellectual property theft for years. So that's definitely not a new agenda of theirs. It's been their focus for a very long time. I think we all know that from headline news. The problem is they've done it in a multi-pronged approach. They did it with implants of people, long-term quote unquote coverts, through academia that they've had planted for very long periods of time. They've augmented it with things like software and access to environments through harvesting information electronically. And they've conned people into sharing information as well. So that's the other part of this, is that they've done a really good job with that. The other thing that's interesting is what people fail to recognize is that nation state adversaries aren't islands unto themselves. They tend to cooperate. If a Russian or North Korean or Iranian nation state actor has an initial access into something, they'll broker it to another country for a price. So there may be one group in a nation state adversary that has much better access to something than the other group does, but the other group can pay them for it and they'll get in. So unfortunately, there's been an onslaught onto our country in such a way that makes it very difficult for us to sort of manage all those beachheads. And so the asymmetry is very challenging. And it ties back to your AI conversation, which is how is that added to it? Just that. It's added this extra level of pressurization onto the systems that we believed were protecting us. And they are indeed failing. Sorry to be doom and gloom, but
No. That's the reason why I have these types of conversations is I want to get this information out, shine light on it. I've had conversations with others about similar topics. Andy Greenberg wrote this awesome
Yeah, I
book,
know Andy really
Sandworm.
well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one of my
absolutely.
favorite, true crime books,
Yeah,
where he wrote about NotPetya. Is that how you
not Petya. Yeah, absolutely.
NotPetya? So,
Hmm.
so that's an
Yeah.
older malware that really wreaked havoc. And
Hmm.
interestingly, one of the companies that it wreaked a lot of havoc on and cost them 250 to $300 million worth of damages, at least before it was all said and done, was Maersk,
Yes.
the global shipping company, right?
Right.
And I believe that Maersk owns the ship that just crashed into the bridge in Baltimore. I'm not at all saying that those two things are
Hmm.
connected, but it calls to mind something that a mutual friend of ours, Renee Aninow, talked about how the holy grail of cyber is making the leap from using cyber to affect a kinetic outcome. Can you talk a
Yes,
little bit about what that means and what kind of
certainly.
risks there are?
This is the nightmare scenario that Hollywood has portrayed for quite some time that's now manifesting into a bit more of a reality. And it's not new, to be honest, Ed. I mean, and the interesting thing is that if you remember Stuxnet as a virus, that was indeed at least one of the first documented cyber tools deployed to affect a kinetic outcome, which in that case was the uh, spinning of the cylinders in the Iranian nuclear facility to destroy them effectively.
Right. In that case, the U.S. launched that attack against Iran,
Correct.
right? Yeah.
U.S. and some allies, if you will. Right? Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And what's interesting about that is that's very visceral because you're talking about physicality and spinning and this and that is quite dramatic. There's far worse, to be honest. There's things like water treatment facilities that can have water levels, the pH change or the potability change just ever so slightly that'll cause a mass dysentery effect. Then you've got a flood onto the pressurization of a hospital environment in a specific location. And then, as we've seen over the course of the pandemic, you conduct a ransomware attack and put the hospitals in a pressurization state where they can't function unless they pay a ransom. And you can really cause a cascading effect. And that's the doom and gloom scenario, of course. But you're completely right. The big concern is if there's that much access to these environments, what can they effectively do? And how much have we given to technology to take over? And unfortunately, I know I said AI for the third time in this conversation, but here again is where our reliance on it and our over um, excitedness to kind of deliver the responsibility over to it may be a little foolhardy at this point because once it's in the hands of something that really doesn't have any kind of emotionality or ability to identify, for example, in my company, I do employ a lot of automation and AI, but I also use human intuition and experience and talent to identify these problems that simply at this point can't be done through technology. And unfortunately, for cost savings and a variety of other reasons, people are choosing to go in the direction where it's all automated. And automation is fantastic when there's nothing coming at it to use it maliciously, but when it can be leveraged against you, you got an issue.
Is it the usual cast of characters that are involved in this? So is it sort of U.S. versus China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, or is it even broader than that?
So there's a lot of copycats, and there's even the cyber criminal contingent that's getting in the mix. And it was one of our first conversations yesterday, which is, are the nation state actors totally bifurcated and separated away from cyber criminals? Are they truly different camps? Some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. There's a lot of nation state actors that moonlight as cyber criminals doing these things, and they are indeed brokering their capabilities, their access, their tools to less capable groups out there that are willing to pay a lot of money for it. So, for example, ransomware, they've heard of ransomware. That's been front page news for a long time. But very few people have heard of ransomware as a service, which means they'll sell you access to a company that they couldn't care less about, but you may have an interest in ransoming. And now someone that has zero technical skill now gets given this video game to play and make a lot of money with. it's pretty incredible. So that's one of the big things. But one more thing that I think is really orthogonal but very relevant to what you just said, and we've been touching on this a little bit. Hacking isn't always about stealing of information and brokering it, or breaking something and using it for a military operation. Sometimes they can actually get in and by design be noisy about their entrance, so they can leak that to the press, so that the stakeholders lose confidence in the stock of, God forbid, a public company. And before all that's happened, this same group has essentially gotten their right positions in a market, put a short on the stock, knowing it's going to be plummeting. And I know it sounds like the plot of a Bond movie, because it was, but that's actually what's going on out there. So some of these efforts are all about manipulation,
Wow.
market movement, and all that. So there's a lot more layers to this than sort of simply one-dimensional hack, steal, hack, break. It's all about perception. It's all about control and manipulation as well. So they've gotten very creative, unfortunately.
Is that similar, Kareem, to what happened back in, I think it was 2015, where a large U.S. government agency had a massive data breach and all employees' personal information that was on file got stolen? Was that sort of a similar, hey, we're just going to show you that we can do it type move?
It was definitely a shot across the bow in a big way. Yeah, that it was the OPM hack, which was big.
Yes.
Office of Personnel Management, and that was massive, because it was essentially, again, a plot of a Bond movie, as funny as this may sound, where they released all the real names of these actual long-term coverts and people that had clearances, and it sort of exposed these extremely expensive, and when I say expensive, it takes a very, very long time to build an asset group like that for a government. So they essentially had to start over in many cases with some of these people that they had as long-term coverts. And yeah, it was an absolute nightmare for the intelligence community, and it still and continues to be so, by the way, Ed. It's definitely not over yet.
I've had people in Washington, D.C. think tanks, defense-oriented, say to me that if we were to have a large-scale superpower conflict, that it could be decided in the first 5 minutes. And it wouldn't be decided kinetically. It would be decided by sort of cyber moves to disable GPS. That intuitively makes a lot of sense to me. But then I look at how long the Russia-Ukraine conflict has dragged on. How do you fit those two together? Is there just a lack of sophistication on Russia's side, or is this intentional? How does it all fit together?
It's a great point. When that all sparked up, and you brought up the Sandworm book with there was, everyone in the community was like, okay, not P2 any minute now,
Right.
going to shut down everything. What's interesting is I don't have an answer of why Russia didn't choose to do certain amounts of debilitation, broadly speaking, unless there was a concerted effort to go in and do more damage to make a stand, to show a power play. Because the whole point about deciding in the first 5 minutes non-kinetically, while it's extremely eerie and concerning, no one would necessarily think that the war was won. It wouldn't be this show of power. So I can't speak for that. This is definitely a very nuanced sort of answer. But to your point, it's very interesting, because the communications aspect of a war is the number one target. Because if you cut down communications or cut off communications, that's your key to winning anything, because at that point, whether it's a ground, naval, or airstrike, all of those require, even if they're unmanned for that matter, there's got to be a level of communication that has to take place. So you're completely correct. That would be a hugely powerful target. What's fascinating is that that methodology does have countermeasures to it. So while there are attacks on those types of things, there are counterattacks that can take those things down. So cyber is much more a game of chess than, in many cases, kinetic wars are. And it's all so rapid and fast and at machine speed, many times we can't really tell what's going on. And one last thing on the Ukraine-Russian conflict, just to kind of add a little bit of an interesting nugget in, the hacktivist contingent got involved. And what that is a proxy militia of people on both sides that are hackers that are interested in backing one group or another that are not tied to the military or an intelligence group, that were boggling things up badly for everyone. There was an incident that happened early in the conflict where a specific hacker group went after what they thought was a train system to help one side over the other, and attacked it and made the mistake that of thinking it was a train system when it was really the anti-proliferation systems of Russia for nuclear attacks, and that put Russia's nuclear defenses on high alert because they thought that that was actually a nation state coming after them. So when you get these, yes, I know it was something that never
Wow.
really hit the headlines very, very broadly, but that's how close we get to these problems that no one really hears about. And that wasn't even a nation state actor working against their adversary. That was a outlier that rolled in just thinking they were being helpful as a vigilante and made a mess of things because they didn't have all the intelligence, and that was the problem. It was loitering and looting from a cyber perspective, trying to support their cause, and that is a mess. So that actually is what keeps me up at night, more so than two controlled nations kind of going at it. As much as I'd hate that too, it's the unbridled militia and cyber proxy militias that worry me the most.
Kareem, how prepared are we? How good are we at playing chess, right? Because
Yeah.
you've got corporations with their own agendas who, as you indicated yesterday, may or may not be all that interested in spending the amount of money and resources that it takes to secure their data. And then you've got the government, and then you've got something like a utility that I know there are sophisticated utilities out there, but there are not so sophisticated utilities as well. Like there's
Right.
just so many points of vulnerability.
Right.
Who's in charge of keeping things safe, if anyone?
No, it's a really good question. And the answer is quite multi-pronged because there's the very clear binary defensive strategy where you have, sword coming at you, you have shield approach, right? Or castle moat strategy, which is what we'll call it. We're in a pretty good place there to the degree that we can be. The problem is our castle is so big and widespread that we fundamentally can't guard all those beachheads. So the countermeasure and the other piece of the answer, which is this is actually a good answer, meaning positive. We're not in the worst place ever. We have the best talent in the world, bar none, without question, and we still fundamentally have some of the most sophisticated technologists, both in government and out, and we do cooperate very, very well. Could always do better. Admittedly, there's always the opportunity for private sector and public to work more cohesively and hand in hand, but that's going to be a work in progress forever. But lastly, what we have at our disposal, which is quite good, is the ability to deliver a narrative for deterrence, because deterrence is the way to do it. If there were ever a cyber attack of magnitude, take, for example, a power grid being taken down, which could happen because there is weakness there, that would, this is an opinion, would constitute an act of war. And so whoever the threat would be essentially conducting a strike that would be akin to a kinetic attack. And I think it's very fair to estimate that we'd probably be in a place where that would constitute an act of war, and the corresponding response might not be cyber, it might be kinetic from our side. And we do have a very, very powerful response in that way. So I think that's where this sort of delicate balance is still maintained at the moment. Now, not sure how much that's going to stay the way it is today, but that's at least the hope that that's going to maintain this sort of delicate ceasefire that we're in at the moment.
You told me a little bit about Vigilocity yesterday, which is the company that you founded. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what you provide? Because you said that there's a lot of cyber companies out there providing defense, so it's not really your niche. What is your niche, and what do you learn by providing what you provide at Vigilocity?
I'm uniquely in a position with the company to be able to identify threat actors' infrastructure when and where they set it up, which is quite unique because most technology is there to do exactly what we just talked about, which is this block and tackle approach. Attack is deployed, you deploy the countermeasure, and hopefully everything gets remediated and we get back to sort of status quo. My strategy is all about proactive, preemptive, and I think I used this word with you recently, which is precognitive. The idea is to be able to identify threats before they actually fully take place, before they fully manifest. Because here's the good news when it comes to this problem, because it is a very asymmetric problem. The bad guys get to kind of work fairly quietly and without much disturbance until such time they want to conduct the attack. I'm one of the few organizations that goes after it in those planning stages. So I can sort of throw a wrench in the system or illuminate the activity in such a way that it nullifies the attack, or they move on, because hacking is interesting. People think, again, start, stop. It's actually more about putting hurdles in the way and making yourself too hard of a target that they actually move on to a lower hanging fruit of some kind. And unfortunately, there's always a lower hanging fruit of some kind. And so part of the strategy here is to be part of the solution, which is to say, if you attack one of these organizations that's working with someone like myself or my firm, you're going to potentially expose your entire operation to being illuminated, and now you lose all of your existing targets. So move on. Go find someone else that's not necessarily guarding themselves in that way. It slightly starts to bleed into this idea of more of an offensive play rather than a purely defensive play. And that's a very controversial topic, Ed, because everybody's like, well, that's the domain of the government. Going after the threat actor is a very touchy thing, and it really is. I'm not an advocate for vigilantism. Everything I just mentioned with regard to the Ukraine situation is exactly why that should never happen. But when you have a controlled and very structured methodology for identifying and helping making infrastructure inert, it's a very powerful capability. And it helps you understand their tactics and methods so that you can actually level the playing field a bit more. Because that's a big part of the problem, is that they're, again, asymmetrically ahead of us because they have all the opportunities in the world, and the defenders generally only have one opportunity to protect themselves. They fail once, bad guys in. Bad guys can try 1,000 times and fail. So very challenging.
As an investor, what can we look for? Is there anything that we can look for or look at to give us an indication that the companies we're investing in are good at cyber defense?
It's hard to see from the outside. In fact, this is exactly why the SEC with public companies has mandated that if there is a material breach, they need to be able to disclose that within 4-day period. That's literally, as of this December, that came out as a mandate from the SEC. For that very reason, that even public companies that are supposed to be as transparent as they come, right, share that these things are actually happening so that we can make informed decisions on whether we work with them, whether we invest in them, and everything else. From a private standpoint, hard to say. The good news is smaller, more nimble companies, harder targets. They're not quite as established and large. It's a harder organization to sort of get into. Understanding how they take cyber, how seriously they take cyber is a very, very big indicator. If their answer is simply that, yes, we're in compliance with all of the compliance standards that we're supposed to be in compliance with, good answer, but not great answer. That's not an indication that they're actually taking security seriously. It means they're actually taking compliance seriously so they don't pay a fine, but doesn't necessarily mean they're actually not going to get hacked. So it's an interesting little test in a way. If I do that, certainly with my investments, I'll ask a company and be like, so what are you doing for, securing your organization? And if you have intellectual property, for example, what are you doing to secure it? And based on that answer, I generally get a pretty good feel whether they know what they're doing or not. The other thing about this is just how much they take their partnerships seriously. I used an analogy the other day, Ed, which was this fellow was not a cyber individual, and he was sort of, I think, had an allergy to it. So he was very, very unwilling to discuss anything technical with me. And I said, let's just leave the technical out of this. Do you have children? And he said, yes. I said, all right. Are they young enough to go spend the night at someone's house? He said, yeah. Oh, yeah, they do it all the time. I said, all right. Do you let your child go spend the night at a new friend's house without any kind of, maybe call the parents, understand a little bit of what that household might be like? And he's like, no, of course not. I get to know the parents. We get a little bit of an understanding of what the situation is. Okay, let's transpose this. Neighbor's house or new kid's friend's house is another organization that you trade data with. Wouldn't you want to know that that organization is a safe harbor for your data? And he finally had the aha moment. So I take their supply chain analysis very seriously when I make investments. That's the next bastion of cyber. It's going to be the black box of everyone else's security, not your own anymore, because you know your own, you just don't know everything outside that perimeter. That's what you really have to figure out. And that's a big, big area that we're going to see blossom, I think, heavily in the next, I'd say, 3 to 5 years in a huge way. And it's catalyzed by things like SolarWinds, Ed. That one sort of was heard around the world as far as supply chain risk.
Wow. Whole new variable for investors to think about.
Huge.
Kareem, this was a great conversation. Let's do this again sometime soon. It was really fun speaking with you.
Would love to. Thanks so much, Ed.
Before you leave, I want to invite you to join my Global Macro Update newsletter. This is a free service that comes out every Tuesday and Friday. I'll send you an email with my latest thoughts on geopolitics, economics, the markets, along with a link to the latest interview and a transcript. If you'd like to join us, hit the link in the description below or go to globalmacroupdate.com and join over 100,000 other Global Macro Update readers. I hope you join us. I'm Ed D'Agostino. Thanks for watching.